They said Barbara Stanwyck could make a man forget his senses with a single smile on screen, off screen. She was equally irresistible and equally complicated. In 1953, during the filming of Titanic, a handsome 22-year-old leading man fell hopelessly in love with Stanwyck, who was then 45. The age gap was scandalous, even by Hollywood standards. So they met in secret and stole passionate moments away from gossip columnist prying eyes. And so her life became a web of secrets and lies, one which would grow ever bigger as the years wore on. Finally, the truth would come out, and much, much more. So, who was Barbara Stanwyck? Before we pull back the curtain on this dark secret, I'd love to know where you all tuning in from. Get your favorite drink ready, get settled, and stay with me as we navigate the scandalous lives and tragic ends of the stars we thought we knew, to understand the woman who would become Hollywood's highest-paid actress. One must first look away from the glittering lights of Los Angeles and descend into the grim, soot-stained streets of Brooklyn in the early 20th century. Long before she was Barbara Stanwyck, commanding the screen with a single arched eyebrow, she was Ruby Catherine Stevens, a child born not into glamour, but into a world that can only be described as a Dickensian tragedy. Born on July 16th, 1907, Ruby was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family that was already teetering on the edge of survival. This was a time when the American dream was often just a mirage for the poor, obscured by the smoke of factories and the struggle for daily bread for little Ruby. The harsh realities of life did not wait for adulthood. They arrived with brutal force before she could even write her own name. The first and most devastating blow came in the winter of 1911. Ruby was only 4 years old. It was a day that began like any other, with her mother, Catherine Stevens, taking Ruby and her brother on a streetcar ride through the bustling avenues of Brooklyn. But in a split second, the mundane turned into a horror show. A drunken stranger, stumbling and belligerent, lurched forward on the moving trolley. In his stupor, he shoved Catherine. The fall was violent. Ruby's mother was thrown from the vehicle, hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. She never got up. The fall caused a miscarriage and, ultimately, killed her. It is impossible to overstate the psychological impact of this moment. A 4-year-old child stood on a cold Brooklyn street, watching her mother be effectively murdered by the carelessness of a stranger in broad daylight. The world, in that instant, taught Ruby a lesson she would never unlearn. Safety is an illusion, and catastrophe can strike from nowhere. But if the death of her mother was a sudden, violent trauma, what followed was a slow, agonizing erosion of trust. 2 weeks after the funeral, while the family was still reeling from shock, Ruby's father, Byron Stevens, made a choice that would seal his daughter's fate. Unable or unwilling to cope with 5 children and a dead wife, he simply vanished. He told the family he was heading off to work on the Panama Canal, a colossal construction project that was consuming men and machines thousands of miles away. Whether he found work there or not is irrelevant. The truth was that he never returned. In the blink of an eye, Ruby was an orphan. She had been abandoned by death, and then abandoned by choice, left clinging to her 14-year-old sister Mildred. Ruby was adrift. Mildred, barely more than a child herself, was working as a chorus girl, touring with cheap vaudeville shows to scrape together a living. She could not possibly care for a toddler. And so, the system took over. Ruby and her brother Byron Jr. were placed into the foster care machinery of New York. This was not the foster care of modern safety nets. This was a system of cold utility, where children were boarded out to families who often viewed them as little more than a paycheck or extra hands for labor. Ruby was shuffled from one home to another, moving as many as 4 times in a single year. It was a childhood defined by severe instability. She was a guest in other people's lives, never a daughter, never permanent. Years later, when asked about this period, Barbara Stanwyck would refuse to pity herself, displaying the armor she had forged in those lonely rooms. She famously shrugged and said that the foster system wasn't cruel, just impersonal. At least nobody beat me, she added. It was a chilling statement, revealing a bar for happiness that had been set heartbreakingly low. However, the reality might have been darker than she publicly admitted. By age 9, Ruby was smoking. By her early teens, she was fighting in the streets, a self-described savage who trusted no one. She had learned that hardship was not something to be bewailed, but survived. But the deepest wound, the one that perhaps explained her later desperation for stability, occurred in the shadows of those foster homes. There are dark chapters in her biography suggesting that the impersonal system was actually deeply exploitative. Sources indicate that around the age of 15, or perhaps even as young as 12, Ruby was expecting a child. The circumstances point to severe abuse by one of her caregivers in the early 1920s. For an impoverished ward of the state, there were no safe options. Ultimately, she suffered through a highly dangerous, unregulated medical procedure that went tragically wrong. It was the kind of grim, unsanitary ordeal that claimed the lives of countless young women in that era. Ruby survived the procedure, but the physical price was steep. The complications left her unable to bear children. This secret tragedy completed the isolation of Ruby Stevens. She had lost her mother to violence, her father to abandonment, and now her own future as a mother had been stolen from her before she was even a woman. Is it any wonder that the woman she became would be known for her icy control and her ability to portray women who needed no one? The tough cookie attitude wasn't a pose. It was a survival mechanism honed in the backstreets of Brooklyn. By 14, Ruby had seen enough of school and enough of relying on a society that had failed her. She dropped out in the 8th grade. I knew that after 14. I'd have to earn my own living, she later said. And I was willing to do that. She took a job wrapping packages at a Brooklyn department store, then worked as a telephone switchboard operator. But the drudgery of low-wage labor could not contain her. Inside the little Brooklyn stray was a fire fueled by the movies she watched at the Nickelodeons, idolizing fearless women like Pearl White. She didn't just want to escape poverty. She wanted to conquer it. She cut her hair, lied about her age, and followed her sister Mildred's path to the stage. She wasn't a trained dancer, but she was a natural-born scraper, with sheer grit. She talked her way into a chorus line at a Times Square nightclub. She wasn't dancing for art. She was dancing for rent. She learned to shimmy in feathers and navigate the predatory gaze of the sugar daddies who frequented the clubs. She learned exactly how to inflame a man's interest and then give him the brush-off, a skill that would later become the trademark of her screen persona. By 1926, the transformation was nearly complete. A theater producer named Willard Mack spotted the 19-year-old chorus girl and saw a raw, undeniable potential. He hired her for his Broadway play, The Noose. But there was one problem. Ruby Stevens sounded like a chorus girl, not a dramatic actress. Glancing at an old program, Mack saw the name of an actress, Jane Stanwyck, and combined it with the fictional character in the play, Barbara Frietchie. At that moment, Ruby Stevens was buried. Rising from the ashes of a tragic childhood was Barbara Stanwyck. It was a hard new name for a hard new woman. She had escaped Brooklyn, but she carried its scars beneath the makeup, a primal wound that would bleed into every performance she would ever give. She was ready to take on the world, armed with a cynicism and a work ethic that only a survivor could possess. If Ruby Stevens was born in the soot of Brooklyn, Barbara Stanwyck was forged in the blinding lights of Broadway. But the transition from a scrappy chorus girl to a silver screen legend was neither smooth nor guaranteed. It was a metamorphosis driven by hunger, not just for food, but for a place in a world that had always treated her as an outsider. The pivotal moment arrived in 1926. Willard Mack, a theater producer with an eye for raw talent, saw something in the 19-year-old dancer that transcended her high kicks and shimmying. He cast her in his melodrama, The Noose. But Mack knew that Ruby Stevens was a name that smelled of cheap perfume and tenement halls. He handed her a program from the old days, pointing to an actress named Jane Stanwyck. And in the play, he said, "You're Barbara Frietchie. So, you're Barbara Stanwyck." Just like that. The orphan girl was erased. In her place stood a woman with a name that sounded like it belonged on a marquee. The Noose was a success, but it was 1927 burlesque that truly launched her into the stratosphere. She played a tragic chorus girl, a role she knew in her bones, and she broke the audience's heart every single night. New York critics, usually a jaded bunch, were captivated by her raw, emotional honesty. She wasn't acting, she was bleeding on stage. Offers from Hollywood began to pour in, but Barbara was hesitant. She was a creature of the stage, terrified of the silent. Judging lens of a movie camera, it was love. Or perhaps a desperate need for guidance. That pulled her west. In 1928, she married Frank Fay, a vaudeville comedian 10 years her senior. Fay was Broadway's golden boy, a smooth-talking MC who promised her the stability she had never known. When Warner Brothers offered Fay a lucrative contract, Barbara packed her bags and followed her husband to Los Angeles. She arrived in 1929, just as the industry was convulsing with the arrival of sound. Her first steps in Tinsel Town were disastrous, by the glossed-over standards of 1920 Hollywood. Barbara Stanwyck was an anomaly. She didn't have the ethereal beauty of Lillian Gish or the exotic glamour of Gloria Swanson. Her voice was low and throaty, better suited for a dive bar than a drawing room. Her first two films, Broadway Nights and The Locked Door, sank without a trace. I knew I was a flop. She later admitted she felt awkward, unpolished, a Brooklyn stray in a city of pedigree show dogs. She was ready to pack it in and head back to New York. But fate intervened in the form of Frank Capra, at her husband's urging. A reluctant Capra agreed to interview Stanwyck for his new film, Ladies of Leisure, 1930. The meeting went poorly. Capra thought she was sullen. She thought he was arrogant. She stormed out of his office. But when Capra viewed her screen test, he was electrified. The camera, which she so feared, loved her. It captured a vulnerability that the naked eye missed. Underneath that porcupine attitude, Capra realized, was a warm, sympathetic heart. Ladies of Leisure was the turning point. As a party girl, trying to go straight, Stanwyck didn't just play the part, she lived it. When the film premiered, a star was born. But this wasn't the distant, untouchable stardom of the silent era. Stanwyck offered something new, a gritty, working-class reality. She became the face of the Great Depression on screen, a woman who knew the price of milk and the cost of survival, throughout the early 1930s known as the pre-code era. Stanwyck blazed a trail of scandalous brilliance. In Night Nurse 1931, she played a caregiver thwarting a murder plot, proving she could be tough as nails. But it was 1933's Baby Face that cemented her reputation as the most dangerous woman in Hollywood, as Lily Powers, a woman who sleeps her way from a speakeasy basement to the top floor of a Manhattan skyscraper. Stanwyck was a revelation. She used men the way men had always used women, as stepping stones. The film was so frankly sexual and cynical that it became one of the primary reasons the draconian Hays Code was enforced to censor Hollywood. Yet, audiences couldn't hate her. Because Stanwyck made them complicit. When she smashed a bottle over a predator's head or outsmarted a bank executive, the depression-weary public cheered. She was the underdog who bit back, behind the scenes. However, the tough, broad persona was a carefully maintained armor. On set, she was known as Missy, a nickname given to her by the crew. It was a term of endearment and respect. Unlike other divas who demanded special treatment, Stanwyck was a soldier. She arrived on time, knew her lines, and knew the lines of everyone else in the scene. She befriended the electricians and the grips, the invisible workers of Hollywood, perhaps seeing in them the reflection of her own working-class roots. But this professionalism hid a deep insecurity. She worked compulsively, churning out up to 4 films a year. "I'm scared to stop," she once confided to a friend. "If I stop, they might realize I'm just Ruby Stevens from Brooklyn." Her zenith came in 1944 with Double Indemnity. Director Billy Wilder cast her against type as Phyllis Dietrichson, the ultimate femme fatale. At first, Stanwyck was terrified. "I'm not a murderer," she told Wilder. "I'm not beautiful enough to trap a man like that." Wilder simply replied, "Well, are you a mouse or an actress?" She took the role and crafted one of the most iconic images in cinema history, the cheap platinum blonde wig, which she personally chose to show the character's tackiness, and the diamond anklet glinting on her leg became symbols of lethal seduction. Her performance was chillingly matter-of-fact. When she delivers the line, "I need him like the axe needs the turkey," she isn't shouting, she's simply stating a business transaction. By the mid-1940s, the unwanted orphan was the highest-paid woman in the United States, earning a staggering $400,000 a year, equivalent to nearly $7 million today. She was a titan of industry. A woman who had constructed a fortress of fame so high that the shadows of her past could almost be ignored. But as the lights of the studio grew brighter, the darkness in her personal life deepened. The Missy who was beloved by her crew was going home to a mansion that felt increasingly like a prison. The higher she rose, the more she had to lose, and the ghosts of Brooklyn were patient. They were waiting for the applause to die down. If Barbara Stanwyck's career was a testament to her iron will, her personal life was a battlefield where she suffered casualties that no box office receipt could ever repair. The higher she climbed, the more the ground beneath her crumbled. The conflict began not with the studio bosses, but in her own bedroom, with the man she had once looked to as a savior. Frank Fay, the golden boy of Broadway who had brought her west, could not stomach his wife's ascent, as Stanwyck became the breadwinner. Fay's career evaporated in the harsh light of the California sun. A proud man with a brittle ego, he descended into a toxic fog of alcoholism. The witty charmer she had married devolved into a bitter, violent drunk. Their home, which should have been a sanctuary, became a war zone. Fay's resentment manifested in terrifying rages, where he would allegedly beat the woman who was paying his bills. It is widely believed in Hollywood lore that the 1937 film A Star is Born, a tragic tale of an alcoholic actor whose fame is eclipsed by his wife, was directly inspired by the disintegration of the Faye-Stanwyck marriage, in a desperate bid to fix a bond that was already shattered. They adopted a son in 1932. They named him Dion Anthony Faye, Stanwyck, who could not bear children of her own due to her traumatic past. Perhaps hoped this would be a new beginning. She was terribly mistaken. The crying infant only annoyed Faye, and fatherhood did nothing to curb his drinking. In fact, having a son seemed to inflame his temper even more. The horror reached its climax on one unforgettable afternoon. In a drunken fury, Faye picked up the toddler, little Tony, and threw him into the swimming pool, leaving him to drown. Barbara, fully clothed, dove into the water to rescue her child. The boy survived, but the marriage was dead in the water. In 1935, after 7 years of misery, she finally found the courage to divorce him. At 28, she was free, but in the golden age of Hollywood. Freedom was an illusion. The studio system was a jealous god, and it demanded total control over its stars' bodies and souls. In 1936, on the set of His Brother's Wife, Barbara met Robert Taylor. He was the polar opposite of Frank Faye, a clean-cut Nebraska farm boy with matinee idol looks and a gentle demeanor. He was 4 years her younger, and she became his mentor, guiding him through the shark-infested waters of MGM. What started as friendship blossomed into a quiet, healing romance for the first time. Barbara felt safe. It was like coming out of an emotional black hole of Calcutta, she later said. But their happiness was a threat to the studio's bottom line. In 1938, the fan magazine Photoplay published a scandalous article titled Hollywood's Unmarried Husbands and Wives, explicitly naming Stanwyck and Taylor as living in sin. The moral guardians of America were outraged. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of MGM, panicked. He summoned Taylor and issued an ultimatum: marry Stanwyck or lose your career. It was a shotgun wedding orchestrated by the PR department. On May 14, 1939, they were married in a ceremony that felt more like a press release than a union of souls. There was no honeymoon. That very night, Taylor dutifully went to his mother's house to break the news, terrified of her reaction. I wasn't sure I was in love, Taylor later admitted, confessing he felt boxed in by the studio for a while. They played the part of Hollywood's golden couple perfectly. They were the royalty of Tinsel Town. But behind the closed doors of their Brentwood ranch, the cracks were spreading. The war years separated them, and when Taylor returned from service, he was a different man. He chafed under Barbara's dominant personality. Seeking validation, he turned to other women. The betrayals were public and humiliating. In 1941, Taylor became obsessed with Lana Turner, the blonde bombshell of MGM. He reportedly begged Barbara for a divorce so he could be with Turner. Stanwyck refused, swallowing her pride to keep the marriage alive. But the knife twisted deeper. In 1948, while filming East Side, West Side, Barbara befriended her co-star Ava Gardner, unaware that Gardner was sleeping with Taylor, in a cruel imitation of art. The film featured Stanwyck as a betrayed wife and Gardner as the other woman. The reality was identical. The final straw came in 1950. Taylor went to Rome to film Quo Vadis and began a flagrant affair with an Italian starlet named Lea Di Leo. The tabloids splashed the scandal across the globe, alone in Hollywood. Barbara read the headlines and realized she had been fighting for a man who had already left her. She issued an ultimatum, come home or it's over. Taylor didn't even try to fight for her. They divorced in 1951, in a final act of Stanwyck justice. She demanded 15% of his gross earnings for the rest of his life as alimony. It wasn't about the money. She was wealthier than he was. It was about extracting a price for the years of humiliation. She vowed never to marry again. I'd rather have my work, she told reporters. And she kept that promise. But the heart is not so easily silenced. In 1953, the 45-year-old legend found herself on the set of Titanic with a 22-year-old newcomer named Robert Wagner. The age gap was scandalous, 23 years. But the chemistry was electric. In Wagner, she saw the ghost of the young Robert Taylor, enthusiastic, gallant, and adoring. They began a passionate secret affair, for a brief, shining moment. Barbara let her guard down. She cooked him dinner, listened to records, and allowed herself to be vulnerable. Wagner later wrote that she showed him how to live. But once again, the system intervened. 20th Century Fox, grooming Wagner as their next teen heartthrob, was horrified. They could not have their leading man entangled with a woman old enough to be his mother. The studio didn't just ask them to stop, and they executed a strike. One morning, Wagner woke up to read a planted story in the papers announcing his engagement to a young actress named Terry Moore. It was a complete fabrication by the publicity department, but the message was clear: end it, or we will ruin you. Barbara, who had spent a lifetime building walls to protect herself, saw the writing on the wall. She knew that if they stayed together, Wagner would become Mr. Stanwyck, and she would be the predatory older woman in the eyes of the public. She ended the affair to save his career. Wagner was devastated, later saying he would have happily remained her man. But for Barbara, it was the final door closing. She withdrew behind her fortress of self-reliance, having learned the hardest lesson of all in Hollywood. Even love is a contract that can be canceled at any time. By the late 1950s, the golden age that had crowned Barbara Stanwyck was fading into history. The big studios were losing their grip, and television was the new frontier. While many of her contemporaries viewed the small screen as a demotion, Stanwyck, pragmatic as ever, saw it as survival. She reinvented herself yet again, this time as the iron-willed matriarch, Victoria Barkley in the Western series The Big Valley, dressed in black, riding high on a horse with a rifle at hand. She proved to a new generation that she was still a commanding presence. Ironically, on the set of The Big Valley, she became a beloved mother figure to her young co-star, Linda Evans, offering the nurturing guidance she had been unable to give her own son. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the mother vanished. She retreated to a home that was becoming increasingly silent. The true turning point of her decline was not professional, but violent. On an October night in 1981, a scenario ripped from one of her own crime thrillers played out in real life. A burglar broke into her Beverly Hills home while she slept. The intruder struck the 74-year-old actress on the head with a flashlight and forced her into a closet. He ransacked the house, stealing $40,000 in jewels. Among the stolen items was a cherished ring given to her by Robert Taylor, perhaps the last tangible piece of the only man she had ever truly loved. Although she eventually freed herself and called the police, the trauma was permanent. Friends noted that after the burglary, the fearless Missy became reclusive, terrified of the world outside her gates. Her physical health began to fail in tandem with her spirit. A lifelong heavy smoker, she suffered from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and heart issues. In 1982, when the Academy finally awarded her an honorary Oscar for her superlative creativity, she was too frail to attend the ceremony. She sent her thanks via video. A ghostly image of the titan she once was. The final curtain fell on January 20th, 1990. Barbara Stanwyck died of congestive heart failure and emphysema at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. She was 82. There is a poetic symmetry to her death. She passed away in the same city where, 60 years prior, she had filmed Ladies of Leisure and launched her legend, true to her fiercely private nature. She requested no funeral and no memorial service. There was no public grieving, no final parade, but even in death, the tough old broad had one last order to give. On her deathbed, she left explicit instructions that her estranged son, Anthony, was not to be allowed to see her under any circumstances. It was an act of astonishing hard-heartedness that shocked those who didn't understand the depth of her scars. Anthony Fay outlived her by 16 years, dying in 2006, having never reconciled with the mother he still longed for. The obituaries the next day hailed her as the greatest actress to never win an Oscar, a backhanded distinction she shared with other luminaries. But the awards didn't matter anymore. The girl from Brooklyn who had fought her way out of the tenements had finally stopped fighting. She left behind a fortune, a filmography of over 80 movies, and a silence that was as loud as her scream in sorry. Wrong number. We began this story with the image of a woman who could make men forget their senses with a single smile. But as the curtain falls, we are left with a far more haunting picture. A woman who spent a lifetime building a fortress so impenetrable that, in the end, she trapped herself inside. The tragedy of Barbara Stanwyck isn't simply that she died alone. It is that she believed she had to be alone to survive. She traded Ruby Stevens, the frightened orphan who watched her mother die on a Brooklyn street, for a mask of invincibility. The audience is drawn to her not because she was a goddess, but because she was, as John Cabal put it, what you hoped regular people were like. She showed us that you can survive a fall from a streetcar or a fall from grace. But she also revealed the terrible price of that survival, a heart that eventually forgets how to trust. However, to view her emotional coldness merely as a personal flaw is to ignore the machinery that manufactured it. Barbara Stanwyck's life is a scathing indictment of the Golden Age studio system, a ruthless machine that treated human beings as little more than cattle. This was a system that forced her into a sham marriage with Robert Taylor to protect the studio's bottom line, and brutally destroyed her genuine love affair with Robert Wagner to preserve a matinee idol's image. It took a girl who had already been abused by the foster care system and taught her that love was dangerous, transactional, and ultimately a liability. While the moguls of the 1930s are long gone, the industry's appetite for consuming the souls of young women remains a dark constant. Stanwyck played the game better than anyone, but her life proves that in Hollywood. The house always wins. Yet, let us not remember her as a victim. That would be an insult to the woman who called herself a tough old broad from Brooklyn. Barbara Stanwyck stands as the undisputed Queen of Noir, a cinematic titan who took the broken shards of her life and sharpened them into weapons. Whether she was the predatory Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity or the iron-willed matriarch Victoria Barkley in The Big Valley, she gave the world women who were complex, dangerous, and unapologetically strong. She proved that a woman didn't need to be traditionally beautiful to be mesmerizing. She just needed to be true. As Cecil B. DeMille observed, she symbolized eternal feminine in all its complexity. Her life was the ultimate American tale, a victory over adversity that left scars too deep to ever fully heal. She taught us that sometimes. The only way to survive the darkness is to become tougher than it, and like the best of her films, her story stands the test of time. Tough, true, and unforgettable. Thank you so much to all of you who've joined us for this deep dive into the shadows of the Golden Age. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have a favorite Barbara Stanwyck movie, let me know what it is in the comments. I love to see you all discussing movies amongst yourselves down there. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.